So I wanted to do another one today, another podcast on the fall and rise of the Western Empire. Usually we do the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, and we've heard that before. But I wanted to go sort of in reverse, the fall and rise of the Western Empire. So in 476 AD, the Western Roman Empire fell. I think it'd be safe to say that the statement is really an oversimplification. Now in the late 5th century, Orestes, a Roman general, placed his son Romulus Augustulus at Ravenna, the capital of the Western Roman Empire. Romulus is typically identified as the last of the Roman emperors of the West. The boy emperor was deposed by Odoacer, himself the son of a general and a Hun. Now Odoacer is considered Italy's first barbarian king, and he sent the imperial insignia to Constantinople. Now, I believe the removal of Romulus Augustulus is the reason for the fall of the empire in the West. The reason why I think that's an oversimplification is there are many events prior to this that really caused the decline and ultimate fall of the Roman Empire, the Western Empire. Now, while the constant barbarian invasions and the rise of Christianity contributed to the fall, there was a decline in the West. It was a series of events that took place gradually. And one of these factors, one of the contributing factors, was the fact that Rome depended on army units from the outskirts of the empire. So, J.M. Roberts writes in A Short History of the World, he says that by the mid-5th century, the, quote, Roman Empire was made up of Visigoths, Franks, Celts, and Burgundians, end quote. Now, the absorption of these troops results in many soldiers from Germanic backgrounds becoming high-ranking military officers. And the barbarian commanders and troops didn't typically invade Rome so much as they kind of settled in the territory in exchange for military service. And many of the barbarian kings in this time considered their homelands part of Rome. So these factors placed these barbarian rulers in a position to exert their power in the Western Empire. Controlling the seas was a crucial part of maintaining power in the empire, but the emperors were becoming increasingly preoccupied with Gaul, what we know as modern day like France, which caused the Romans to neglect Africa. Now, while they controlled Italy, southern Gaul, Africa, the Spanish coasts, and the seas, essentially the Mediterranean being a Roman lake, the Romans could continue their reign over the empire in the west. But without Africa, without complete control of the Mediterranean, Rome could not hope to hold on to power. Now, another reason for the fall of the empire in the West, given by Edward Gibbon, his famous book, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, which he started in 1776, to him it was due to the, quote, triumph of barbarism and religion, end quote, with Christianity undermining the empire from within, by basically helping to turn warriors and soldiers into monks and priests. And the barbarians threatened the empire from the outside. Now, struggles were both internal and external, so it was just a matter of time before this empire is going to fall. And others still hold to the opinion that it was due to the decline of morality and the fact that the Romans were descending into debauchery that caused Rome to become so involved in sexual excess that they neglected to see the crumbling of the moral fiber around them. However, this does not explain the survival of the Byzantine Empire in the East, the Eastern Roman Empire, the capital of which was Constantinople. It survived for another 1,000 years. Now, there are other possible reasons, such as economic reasons, in addition to the social reasons for the decline and the fall. Now, I was reading The History and Conquest of Ancient Rome by Nile Rodgers, good book. He indicates that malaria may be partially to blame due to deforestation of the mountains that helped to form marshlands that became a breeding ground for the mosquitoes, of all things. This would be interesting, I think, for maybe students of epidemiology to check into this. It's quite interesting. Now, from 165 AD on, plagues affected the empire and may have played a considerable part in their fall as well. However, the Eastern Empire also suffered similar afflictions, but they survived. There was I believe they called it the Justinian Plague, and the Eastern Empire survived that. But with the invasions by the Vandals in the early 5th century AD, who were pushed back by the Visigoths, with no small persuasion by Rome, to finally settle in North Africa, Rome effectively lost the North African coast. It was gone. And they'd held that for some time. That's where the Carthaginians were. Carthage, with Hannibal, with his famous march of his elephants over the Alps. You know, he did that when he would, basically they'd find a crack, or they'd make some type of small crack in the in the mountain itself, and then they'd hammer in these sort of wedges of wood, and they'd pour water over them, and as they would freeze, they would expand. I love that part. That is so innovative on behalf of Hannibal, being one of the great military geniuses of history. But he, invaded Rome with elephants, and he didn't do it crossing the ocean. Well, he did, but he went through the Alps. Quite interesting. So we'll get to that at another time. So we know that they lost the North African coast, the Romans did. So with the loss of Africa, the economic base of the Western Empire shrunk quite a bit. It shrunk considerably, primarily just to Italy. And the Vandals crossed the Mediterranean in 455 AD and sacked Rome again. So you have military, religious, social, and economic problems all contributing to the fall. But Rome also suffered from civil wars. And they also didn't have a good system of succession. Diocletian set up a type of succession for his tetrarchy, but he didn't account for what the historians would call the hereditary sentiment among the army and those contesting for the empire. So there were internal coups, there was palace intrigue, there was constant infighting in general, and these all contributed to the fall of the West. And by the time it collapsed, the empire was, as again, going back to the Rogers text, it was considered irrelevant. Most people didn't really care, and it collapsed, quote, almost unnoticed, unquote. Now, we know that it was noticed. I mean, there was also declared that Rome, the mother of the world, has fallen. People didn't think it could happen. We're talking about an empire, or at least a group starting with the Etruscans. This lasted about 1,000 years, and the empire in the West lasted another 1,000 years after this one fell. So for it to fall, it didn't think it was possible. Nobody did. Now, getting back to 476 AD, which again is a commonly accepted date of the fall. Some people date it about 30 or 40 years later, but we'll stick with this date for now. So we see again the deposition and replacement of the last Western emperor by a Germanic barbarian. The Western Empire was effectively replaced by kingdoms who were made up of Germanic peoples. And Rogers, the James Roberts text, he writes, quote, a line can be conveniently drawn under the story of the empire, which begin with Augustus, but there are no simple endings in history. It ended with another Augustus, and I tend to agree with him. Now, even though it didn't end exactly then, because its influence is still felt. And we say Rome fell, and it did. But the influence, we still have it today, just as there are lessons to be learned from it. To this day, the empire really influenced Western civilization from its republic predecessor to the Christian inheritors of it. We use many of the ideas from the culture of that time to benefit our own society in modern times. Indeed, the Pope in the Vatican, the central authority of the Catholic religion, it still exists in Rome. And the freedom of religion signed into law by Constantine and Licinius, it can really be seen as a template for our own First Amendment here in the United States. The concept of freedom of religion and worship, while it was foreign to a great extent in the Dark Ages and the Middle Ages, it's thriving in our modern society. Rome, it could be argued, was also the world's first superpower. And as such, it's a precedent that's still used as an example throughout the modern world. And though Rome was brutal in its conquests, it was also very tolerant of other cultures, as long as certain Roman laws, such as tributes and taxes, were adhered to. Rome, we can use it as a cautionary tale to the civilizations that follow, including our own. Like America, Rome was a melting pot of other ethnicities, races, cultures, religions, belief systems. Like America in the first few hundred years, Rome was guilty of slavery, a great deal of slavery. Some wealthy Romans could have as many as 10 or 20,000 slaves. They don't teach this quite a bit in history. In many places in the Roman Empire, 1 in 2 people were slaves. At the very least, we know roughly 20 to 30% of the Roman Empire were slaves. And we're talking an empire of up to 70 million people. Imagine that, 14 million minimum at any given time. It's horrible. So Rome was guilty of slavery. They were guilty of racism to an extent. A lot of times it was more had to do with classes or conquered peoples that they enslaved. They didn't do similar to what we did here where you were born a slave. A lot of that didn't occur. Some did. Don't get me wrong, and there are historians that will probably, refute that. But for the most part in my studies, slavery was based on conquered peoples or on social status. But they were also guilty of discrimination and corruption, high corruption. The emperors, for the most part, were just hedonistic, corrupt people. I do not want to draw the line between modern-day politicians, but there's that inference too. Now, considering cultures other than its own, barbaric and brutish. So Rome looked at other peoples like what they would call barbarians, which basically meant just they were bearded peoples with red hair, like Frederick Barbarossa meant red beard. And they considered them brutish. They considered them uncivilized barbarians. But ironically, many in modern society would consider the actions of the Romans themselves to be barbaric. Maybe Rome fell because it became too large to control. We know this to be a reason. We believe it to be. Or maybe the gradual absorption of other cultures weakened the idea of what it was to be Roman. Now, there are some people in our modern times in America that would argue this as well. I'm not arguing this as far as a nationalistic or jingoistic sense, but more the idea that when Rome outsourced basically its military and things like that to people that weren't Romans, and then they couldn't pay them, then they were invaded by those same people. And so that's another idea. What it was to be Roman. There was actually a certain, what is the word? Civil Romanus sum, right? I am a Roman citizen. There was something to that. And so, maybe that helped to weaken the empire also. They also abandoned the sense of a common national identity for an individualistic cultural identity. We see that today also. Very interesting. Also, they neglected to learn from generations and rulers that preceded them. This is one of my pet peeves. We do not learn from these cycles or the cyclical nature of history. We don't learn from these historic cycles. We see them, we tend to destroy them, we tend to cover them up, we tend to deny things, and we never seem to learn from them. So that's another thing. And maybe the West didn't fall, it just evolved into something else. So maybe modern Western culture, such as what exists in the United States, are a great experiment. As a constitutional republic, and a descendant of Western civilization is the most recent step in that evolution, a natural progression and an adaptation of ideas to enable us to survive as a people with a multicultural past, but yet retaining a common national identity based on, now get this, based on the principles of what it means to be free. And I think that's what speaks to America today. I think we're the inheritors of the Western Empire, so to speak, in the modern sense. Even though we have a sort of a national identity, we're all Americans. We're this great melting pot. We're this great experiment as a constitutional republic. We're not a true democracy. It's not majority rule. We vote for our representatives. We're modeled so much after ancient Greece and Rome, but after the republic. Not republic as in Republican in the sense of a political party, but just the system and the framework of that government. And again, maybe we survive, and maybe the different cultures, instead of weakening like they did with Rome, because Rome really ceased to care about itself as a whole, and consider themselves, and people outside consider them, pretty much irrelevant and outdated. But our multicultural past, all this great melting pot of immigrants and people that came in, and my own ancestors and family were these folks that came in, but yet have a common national identity, and it's based around the concept of liberty, the concept of what it means to be free, and those principles. Well, thank you for listening. God bless you. I hope you learned something, and feel free to contact me with any questions or comments. Thanks again. Bye-bye now.